Hi, everybody. Chad here. I've recently started a Patreon account. So if this podcast resonates with you and you'd like to help me wake up the world one podcast at a time, then you can find me on Patreon, sign up, and you get 10% off merch. Coming soon. Philip K. Dick is one of the most famous and unusual science fiction authors of modern history. And in 1977, in Metz, France, he gave a speech about what he believed to be the truth about reality.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is.
Network containers. That's how supposedly the aliens look at us.
It would be a shift in the knowledge of humanity, a new knowledge.
What the hell is going on?
What is time? Have you ever thought about that? What is it? No matter what time it is, it's always right now. It's never yesterday. Tomorrow is the day that never comes. And it's always today. Is it really just a linear sequence of events? Past, present, and future? So what happened 2,000 years ago is over with and we can never go back to it? We're just continually marching forward, and every second that is passed is a second that we can never get back? Is that really the only way to think about time and to make sense of just how this reality works? Or is that the way we've been trained to see it? Now imagine if thinking about time in that way acted as a type of prison, limiting our actions and our expectations from reality. You could almost call it a type of thought prison, and that by perceiving time as linear, we become stuck and aren't able to ascend into higher consciousness ways of thinking. Well, there's a famous science fiction author named Philip K. Dick. He is considered one of the most important figures in 20th century science fiction. He's authored 44 novels and had at least 16 movies made from his work. Some of them include Blade Runner, Minority Report, Total Recall, The Adjustment Bureau. This guy was no slouch, and he clearly had some very interesting ideas. And in 1977, he gave a speech at a science fiction convention in Metz, France. And in that speech, he said that he believed that the true hidden teachings of Jesus were actually about time, what it is, and how to navigate it to get to a better version of Earth, the kingdom of God. He believed that the true teachings of Jesus were actually referring to a lateral arrangement of worlds, like a plurality of overlapping Earths, along whose linking axes a person can somehow move to these different versions of Earth that range from worse to fair to good to excellent. And Philip believed that Jesus was not talking about some far-off heaven after death, but a reality that was already here, trying to break through into our world. So it wasn't about teaching dogma, but it was about a perceptual shift. Now let's just imagine for a second that that's true. That the real teachings of Jesus were actually about time and parallel realities and how to shift to them. And that there's this ultimate parallel reality that he called the kingdom of God. And it's not some religious type thing, but it's actually a more perfect version of Earth. and a reality where humanity is free from the burdens that have been placed on us. Now, when I think about that idea, I don't think it's that far out there. A few years ago, I got this book called Believing is Seeing, and it's by a guy named Dr. Michael Gillen, and he was a physicist at Harvard, and he later became an ABC News science editor. And in his book, he talks about how, as kind of like a hobby on the side, for years and years, he would research different religions. And as he worked his way through the religions over the years, from Hindu to Buddhism to Muslim, he finally made it to Christianity. And he said that when he read the words of Jesus, they sounded to him different than anything he had read in any other of those religions. And there was one reason why. He said that Jesus was basically speaking his language. And I don't mean English. He said that Jesus was speaking quantum physics. He said that many of the truths that Jesus was teaching in the New Testament parallel quantum physics. The miracles Jesus did, like feeding the 5,000 with just a few loaves of fish and bread, and don't forget the walking on water, those defy the laws of physics. And Jesus' idea of being fully divine and fully human, that challenges rational logic in a way that's similar to how light can be both wave and particle at the same time. And when you think of the fact that Jesus is said to have been born at the beginning of a new astrological age, it was changing from Aries to Pisces. Now, the age of Pisces is associated with a fish symbol, and that's why the Christians have the fish symbols on the back of their cars to this very day. And guaranteed, 99.9% of them have no idea that is actually connected to the age of Pisces. And I've always thought that it was kind of funny that 2,000 years ago, they decided to start at year zero. But it turns out they didn't. First of all, zero wasn't even invented until 700 AD. And the guy that had the idea to reset the clock was a Roman monk named Dionysius. And he created a calendar which counted the years before and after Christ's birth. Over time, it became the standard of Western Europe and eventually the whole planet. Or at least, that's the official story. But there's a part of me that wonders if that's just really a countdown clock. Because the astrological ages change around every 2,000 years. And we just happen to be right now in the middle of changing from Pisces to Aquarius. And just the very fact that Jesus was born at the changing of the astrological ages, and then he becomes some influential figure that changes the entire planet. And so, if it is true that he was actually teaching about time, what it is, and how to shift to better versions of Earth and parallel realities, then that would be one of the most top secret things in the world. Now, the next question is there any evidence? Is there anything when we look back on history that shows that they were trying to hide something? If his true teachings about time and shifting realities were actually out there, is there any stories of certain types of early Christians that they didn't like? Well, how about let's look at it this way. Is there any evidence that there was a certain type of early Christians that believed something quite different than the mainstream Christians do now? Well, you know, it turns out there was. There was a sect of early Christians called the Gnostics. Others refer to it as Gnostic mysticism, And if they did have these true time-shifting teachings of Jesus, then that may be why Rome hijacked Christianity and made it into a state religion and got rid of the true teachings of Jesus. And there were men that had their entire careers centered around suppressing these true teachings of Jesus about what reality is. And now the big question is, what was the idea that they were suppressing? What were they calling heresy? Well, let's start by looking at the actual word heresy. It comes from the Greek word heresis. It means a choice, course of action, or a school of thought. And the word was initially neutral, referring to any philosophical or other systems of beliefs. But it was adopted by the early church fathers to mean a departure from orthodoxy, and that eventually led to its negative connotation of false or dangerous religious ideas. So they basically took a neutral word and demonized it. Kinda like the word conspiracy theory. Really, that is the new heresy, isn't it? Oh, that guy's just into conspiracy theories. If you think about it, conspiracy theory is a pretty neutral word. It is not that radical of an idea to think that people with power conspire against the people they're supposed to be helping. So it's easy to see that slapping the term conspiracy theory or heresy on something is like putting a big do not enter sign on whatever idea you don't want people to explore. And that is definitely what the early church fathers did. In around 180 AD, a guy named Irenaeus wrote a book called Against Heresies. It was a 5-volume work aimed at what he saw as dangerous heresies, especially these Gnostic teachings. He was obsessed with rooting out as what he saw as distortions of Christianity. And the funny part is that without his work, huge amounts of Gnostic history, myth, and practice would have been lost. But because he decided to write a 5-volume book about how much he hates the Gnostics, he actually preserved the very thing he was trying to destroy. And that's where history got its first "Don't!" Yeah, I'm sure this guy was a real piece of work. And it goes to show you that when we resist something, you're actually energizing the very thing you're against. And so by resisting it, you are giving it energy and keeping it alive. And so for centuries, his 5-volume book Against Heresies kept it on life support, even though it was in a negative light. And other than that, there was nothing left after the Romans and early church had burned, banned, and erased everything they could of Gnostic mysticism. And then, in 1945, a farmer in Upper Egypt, digging for fertilizer near Nag Hammadi, stumbled upon a clay jar. And inside that clay jar was 52 ancient texts, hidden for over 1,500 years. And these texts talked about a different type of spiritual worldview. It talked about cosmologies of light and shadow, secret gospels, visions of Jesus no one in Rome would have ever wanted you to read. And that makes me think, what were they trying to hide? What about these teachings were so disruptive to the Roman Empire and to its church that it created, the Roman Catholic Church, which is where we basically get our modern Christian worldview from? How far off from that are these teachings? That they would burn and arrest and kill people over this idea. And they had so much energy and hatred for this idea that entire careers were devoted to it. So now the question is, what do the Gnostics think? How do they see reality? Well, they think that this reality is a flawed copy of a higher, perfect reality. And they thought that humanity was trapped in an illusion, that right now we're in a prison and we've mistaken it for like a palace. For them, true knowledge, or gnosis, that's the Greek word for knowledge or awareness, true knowledge was becoming aware of this illusion, and that knowledge is the key to waking up. And they believed it was possible for us to have a deep experiential awareness of who we are and what's really going on. So they saw that this world was flawed, and above and beyond this world is something they called the pleroma. It's like a higher dimension filled with pure light and spirit. And it's populated by something called aeons. They're like emanations or aspects of the true unknowable God. And that the highest of these aeons includes somebody named Sophia, which is the Greek word for wisdom. And she plays a central role in the Gnostic myths. And as the story goes, Sophia, she accidentally creates a being outside of the pleroma, or that higher dimension. And this being is called the demiurge. And this demiurge is a false god who ignorantly creates the material universe, imperfect and filled with suffering. And some Gnostics equated this demiurge with the God of the Old Testament, a jealous, controlling deity who demands worship. So in their eyes, this physical world is a cosmic mistake, or, as Philip K. Dick called it, a black iron prison. But there's good news. The Gnostics also believe that humans are unique because within our material body is a spark of divine light that comes from the pleroma, that higher dimension. And they saw most people as asleep, hypnotized by this false reality, while we're serving the demiurge without even knowing it. But there are also some people who can awaken to gnosis and can remember their true home and origins. So in the Roman version of Christianity, the whole idea was believe and obey. Basically, salvation comes through obedience to a book and authority figures. But the Gnostic teaching is wake up and remember. Through mystical experiences and secret teachings from Christ, the Gnostics could be liberated from the material world. So their version of salvation was escaping the cycle of illusion. Now the Gnostics, they also had, like the Christians do, an end-time theology. But theirs is a little different. Now I'm no Gnostic expert here, but from the way I read it, they believe that the material world that was created by the demiurge would eventually end somehow. That instead of being redeemed, it would eventually collapse or fade away. Some describe it as a type of cosmic reset, when the illusion breaks down and reality shines through. Now, the humans that have interacted with their divine spark would ultimately awaken through gnosis. And at the final unveiling, these sparks would ascend past the rulers of the black iron prison, And those rulers are called archons. And remember, that's where we get the word anarchy from. No archon. And those who do not awaken, who remain ignorant, those would be trapped in the cycle of matter. And some think that they could perish with the world and possibly be stuck in some type of reincarnation loop. So basically, just think of the Bill Murray movie Groundhog's Day. That's the easiest way to understand it. So the Gnostics believed that Jesus didn't come here to deliver humanity from their sins, but they believed his real mission was to give humanity secret knowledge that helps them escape this cyclical time wave. And they anticipated some type of pulling back of the curtain, that the demiurge's false world would be dismantled and what was hidden would be revealed. So basically, waking up and seeing that time and history is an illusion. And I think that may be exactly what's going on in the world right now. You know, that reminds me of on a recent podcast, Eric Weinstein was talking about his GU theory. And he said to the host, "What is time?" Wait a minute. Has Eric discovered Gnostic thought through mathematics? Who knows? Now this all leads us back to a September day in 1977. Philip K. Dick was asked to speak at a science fiction convention in Metz, France. He had quite a big fan base in France, and so there was a real appetite to hear him speak and talk about his writings. But instead of giving a typical writer's talk, he read a speech entitled, "If you think this world is bad, you should see some others." And he made it clear that he believed that this speech is the truth about reality. And he did admit that he could be totally wrong, and what he's talking about may not even be true at all. But he said he had an experience a few years earlier. And these are the conclusions that he had come to. He said that time is not linear, that it's more like a layered structure than just a straight line, and that history isn't just a one-way arrow of past, present, future, but it's multiple versions of these one-way arrow, multiple pasts, multiple presents, and multiple futures, all stacked and running in parallel, all at the same time. And we humans who are stuck in this, as he calls it, matrix, have the ability to laterally shift sideways into different timeline realities. And along this lateral time axis are realities or parallel Earths that range from, as he puts it, from worse to fair to good to excellent. And he says that the true teachings of Jesus are about how to laterally move on this time axis between parallel Earths. And that's how we get to the kingdom of heaven. That Jesus' teachings teach us how to laterally move to a parallel Earth that is excellent. And Philip called this orthogonal time. And he believed that linear time is past, present, future. Orthogonal time is a second axis of time at a right angle to linear time, if that makes sense. So instead of just moving forward, reality has a hidden dimension where events and possibilities are stacked sideways. And so just as we can laterally shift to the kingdom of heaven, we can also laterally shift to worse versions of Earth. But the good news is, he said that orthogonal time intersects our linear time at every point, but we don't see it, which means the kingdom of heaven is always present, that eternity isn't ahead of us in the future, but it's right next to us, hidden at a right angle to ordinary time. And Philip believed that Jesus' mission was to teach his disciples how to move along this orthogonal path. That Jesus wasn't merely reporting that the kingdom of heaven exists, but he was teaching them the method of how to get there. So now, the most important question in the world is, what the hell is this method? What is the method to laterally shift to the kingdom of heaven? Well, Philip believes that the Roman government crushed it. Remember what they did to the Gnostics? They burned, killed, and erased every shred of evidence. And the ironic part is the only thing that kept Gnosticism alive for the last 1700 years was Irenaeus' hatred of it. Remember his 5-volume book on about heresies?
Don't!
Well, that kind of makes you want to stop thinking about everything you hate. Now, Philip says, although this secret was lost, perhaps we can still find it. And he goes on to explain that Christ and the Apostle Paul both seem to say emphatically that an actual breaking through into time, into our world by the hosts of God will unexpectedly occur. In the book of Matthew, Jesus says, "So you must be ready because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." In other verses, he said, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day the Lord will come." Other verses, he said, "Be on guard and to be alert." So that paints the picture that we have to be on guard, be alert, be ready. You could say, be awake. And the opposite to being awake is being asleep, which gives us the idea that you could miss something, like some type of opportunity, some type of event, like an open window, or maybe an open portal. Like something breaks through into time, but if our eyes are not open, we won't see it. Or should I say, if our third eyes are not open, we won't see it. And Philip goes on to say, in modern terms, basically, that some of us will travel laterally to this better world, and some will not. They will remain stuck along this lateral axis, which means for them, the kingdom did not come in their alternative world. And in meantime, it came in ours. So the kingdom comes, and yet at the same time, it does not come. He then goes on to talk about how after this kingdom comes, or should I say, when we laterally move over to that parallel earth, they will have 1,000 years of peace. Now that 1,000 years of peace idea comes from the book of Revelation. So Philip is saying that that is not just a prophecy from the Bible, but it's a report of an alternate reality that can be laterally accessed. But as Philip makes the point in his speech, it can only be laterally accessed by those who have done their homework and chores. Those people who have generally paid attention and, as the Bible puts it, not gone to sleep. And when I heard that, I thought, that sounds familiar. You know, that sounds to me with what the lady told Chris Bledsoe. She told him that a new knowledge was going to fill the earth, that the wars would end, and we would have 1,000 years of peace. But she stressed emphatically that people needed to let go of fear. So buying into fear and fear-type ideology keeps us asleep, which keeps us from discovering this method of how to laterally move to better realities. And the real interesting part is that the lady refers to herself as many names, but one of the names is Sophia. Remember, Sophia is the Aeon who created the demiurge that created this universe. She is the divine feminine, and he was told that the divine feminine is coming back to Earth. So if that's true, that means Chris Bledsoe has had contact with the Aeon that created the entity that created this universe. That's pretty crazy. And he's not the only one who's had contact. People all over the world have reported getting messages from this type of lady. And in the episode I did, The Lost Ark, Nazis, and Israel, I talk about how I've been in contact with a writer named Nicole Van Denning. And she had a powerful dream she shared with me about seeing this lady just as Bledsoe described. And the message she was given was, remember Jericho. And the walls of Jericho, they represent structures of control, or the black iron prison. Or you could even say the walls of Jericho represent truth's protective layers. And if you remember the story of Jericho, they marched around the city 7 days with the Ark of the Covenant, and then blew these trumpets and shouted really loud. And that brought the walls down in this ancient fortified city. So these walls crumbled through sound resonance, or you could say vibration. So it kind of gives the idea that you could see, is this teaching that humanity will hit a certain vibrational point that will collapse these structures of control and liberate us? You know, that reminds me of our old friend Terence McKenna. He talked about a point of singularity where novelty becomes infinite and time, as we understand it, reaches a type of end point. Well, maybe he's referring to the illusion of time as we understand it. Maybe he's also referring to the end of this thought prison. And it's interesting that Terence felt that this singularity could be driven by advancements in technology, particularly AI and human-machine interfaces. And don't forget, he was saying this stuff back in the 90s. And right now, it seems closer than ever. And now we have Eric Weinstein joining the club, saying that his GU theory may have discovered mathematical formulas that can take us to the stars and change how we see time. You know, it's crazy to think that Terence McKenna, Philip K. Dick, and Eric Weinstein may all be talking about the same thing, but just from different perspectives. Philip goes on to say in his speech that the very fact that we can even entertain this idea is a first step in understanding it. But he doubts that we will ever be able to scientifically demonstrate that this lateral change process actually occurs. You know, and I think that's an interesting point. Now let's take somebody like, I don't know, how about Neil deGrasse Tyson? With his materialist-based, if we can't measure it, it doesn't exist, science worldview, how could anyone ever convince him that Philip's theory is true? The only way that Neil would believe it's true is if you could build some type of machine where he could go to all these lateral dimensions. Because if he can't see it with his eyes, or comprehend it in a type of linear sequence in his mind, or touch it with his hands, then it doesn't exist at all. Which means he will never be able to consciously laterally move to better and better versions of Earth. Poor guy, he's stuck here. That type of thinking completely disconnects us from our heart. And we may end up finding that the technology we've been pursuing has been inside of us the entire time. And that the uncomfortable truth is, we are reality projection machines. Which means we create whatever we think about. Whatever we are the vibration of. Which means the most important thing a human could ever do is face their own shadow. And it's not about being religious or even philosophical. It's about simply fixing our projector so that we stop projecting distorted views about reality. But if we can't scientifically demonstrate this process, then how are we supposed to see it? Well, he says that the way we see the effects of these lateral, orthogonal time dimensions and parallel Earths is in, well, for one, déjà vu. He believed that déjà vu is literally a glimpse into another axis of time, the same moment replayed, but shifted a little. I feel like I've said this before. He also felt that synchronicities were a type of evidence because they suggest a hidden structure shaping events beyond cause and effect. He believed that orthogonal time is the structure upon which synchronicities hang. Now, another way he thought you could see it is in religious or mystical experience. Like how he saw what Jesus was actually referring to with the kingdom of God. That it's not something that's coming later, but it's something that's already here. And that when someone experiences visions and encounters with what feels like the eternal, that those are actually signs that you're perceiving the other axis. And he also believed that other ways to see evidence of orthogonal time are in works of art and inspiration. That sometimes art carries encoded traces of the orthogonal timeline. In fact, Philip believed that many of his own novels were him unknowingly channeling messages from orthogonal time into horizontal time. Which, if you're familiar with his work, it's easy to see. Most of his stories are about alternate realities or different versions of Earth where things are just rearranged different. Like in his book, Man in the High Castle. That's about an Earth where the Nazis and Japan won World War II, and they took over the United States and split it down the middle. Now, it's easy to see that science is constrained by linear measurable cause and effect. And orthogonal time, by definition, it doesn't operate that way. It's vertical, eternal, and it cuts across linear sequences. And it really does sound like quantum physics. Now let's just stop for a second and do a recap here. We've laid out what Philip believes reality is. That there is orthogonal time, that we can shift laterally to better or worse versions of Earth, and that the actual teachings of Jesus were Gnostic mysticism, and that Rome had erased those ideas from the collective consciousness of humanity, so that the method of how to navigate orthogonal time consciously has been lost. And the only evidence that we have that this is real is in experiences in our own life like déjà vu, synchronicities, religious or mystical experiences, which I would include dreams in that. And those are all things that science would call coincidence. It almost looks like that material-based science is a governance-type system, and it refuses to give people permission to trust their own experiences if it doesn't fit into the scientific narrative. So it forces people to suppress their own judgment because they don't have permission to believe it's true. So it's a type of thought prison. And now the next question is, where did he get these ideas from? Where did he get the idea that many of his stories are residual memories from other parallel Earths and realities? Well, he got the idea at the dentist. In late February of 1974, he went to the dentist to have some impacted wisdom teeth removed. And so, of course, they put him under, and they gave him a drug called sodium pentothal, also known as truth serum. And as he says, later that day when he got home, he was still heavily under the influence of the sodium pentothal. And as he puts it, he had an acute flash of recovered memory. He says that in one instant, he got it all, this entire idea. Now, he initially rejected it, and about a month later, he was flooded with even more residual memories. And that's where he came to believe that many of his stories are residual memories of parallel Earths that exist right alongside ours, which gave him the idea that time is not linear, in that there is another parallel present, or you could say another parallel now. And that while he was under the influence of this sodium pentothal, it caused the veil to slip, and he could see other parallel realities running alongside of ours. And as he puts it, he was no longer in California. Instead, he was in ancient Rome in the year AD 70. It was shortly after the fall of Jerusalem, and he was a secret Christian, part of the persecuted church. And he said that this atmosphere wasn't dreamlike, but it was absolutely real. And he could feel the fear of the Roman Empire's presence. And as time went on, he would have more flashes of residual memory. And as he puts it, people claim to remember past lives, but I claim to remember a very different present life. And he believed the reason that he had written such a body of work that was based on themes of worse versions of Earth under tyrannical police states was to stir subconscious subliminal memories in readers of what a tyrannical police state is like and how vital it is along any time track and any world to defeat it. And Philip also believed that the Roman Empire didn't truly fall, that it merely just changed shape, and that it's still around today, continuing its influence through modern institutions and ideologies. He would say that the Roman Empire never ended. He saw it as more of a timeless domination structure, and that we can see it today in the military-industrial complex, the modern states, and centralized power. And that's what he meant when he referred to the Black Iron Prison. And he saw Rome as the pinnacle of materialism and authoritarian control, and that our contemporary world is a descendant and a continuation of that imperial mentality, and that it's kind of like a spiritual constraint on humanity. But for me, the most interesting part about this idea is about a parallel Earth that Philip went to. he said that he went to an earth that he called the Palm Tree Garden. And it was peaceful, beautiful, and free of oppression. And that in this earth's history, Christianity never existed, which meant that Rome's reaction to Christianity never happened, and that their history unfolded without oppressive structures. So they were a world of innocence and freedom. And when I heard that, well, that reminded me of something. That reminded me of good old Terence McKenna's theory, the fractal soliton of improbability. I did my second podcast episode on it, and in it, I discuss how Terence McKenna, while meditating in his usual fashion, which means he was probably tripping on shrooms, in the Amazon, of course, and he heard from this voice that he called the Logos. And this voice told him how this universe was created by a lower being and not the all-omniscient God. And that this being wanted to insert himself in his creation. So he incarnated onto the earth as the Christ, Jesus. But the power of that incarnation was so great that it split Earth in two. What I mean is, it created an exact copy of Earth, but in a parallel reality. And everything about that Earth was exactly the same, except for one thing. In that parallel Earth, the Christ never came. Which means that Rome never had its reaction to Christianity. So it didn't get all religious and oppressive, which meant it didn't stop science. And because of that, they got to the moon in 1200 AD. And because there was no religion on this earth, they embraced the traditional shamanic culture, and they merged that with science and Greek thought. And this Greco-Roman shamanic science culture eventually discovered us. And Terence also said that when the Christ came into Earth and it split off the parallel Earth, that it created a time island in between us. And because it's an island in between two time streams, there is a date in time when those streams will meet up. Now that definitely lines up with what the Gnostic mystics thought 2,000 years ago. And he also talked about how our Earth sends ripples to the other parallel Earth when we detonate nuclear weapons. And so the UFO type activity that happens around all the nuclear power plants and missile sites are actually this parallel Earth monitoring us. And that they are the UFOs. Now that's quite the twist. That the UFOs are a parallel Earth of us trying to contact us to help save us from ourselves? And is this the parallel garden Earth that Philip K. Dick visited? Now when he talks about his short time on this parallel Earth, he said that he had the impression that that was actually our legitimate home, but that we had somehow lost it. And he said that this world had something to do with Aphrodite. That's the goddess of love and beauty. She's also an image of harmony and freedom and grace. He said their religion, their spirituality, was far more beautiful than anything his religion could ever conjure up. And he said that it was with a bitter sense of loss that he saw that world go. And most of that loss came to that he would not be able to see her again. So this world had a strong influence of the divine feminine. Now remember Sophia, who may well be the lady that has visited Chris Bledsoe and many others around the world. In Gnostic mythology, she is the Aeon that created the demiurge that created this universe. And now the real wild part about all this is that Philip says someday, when the correct variables in our past are realigned somehow or reprogrammed, that this better version of Earth will materialize superimposed on top of us. And that as we awaken to it, we will suppose that we have always been there, and that the memory of this lower version of Earth will be eradicated from our memories. Now that idea reminds me of a verse in the book of Revelation that says that God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Now this verse is used to describe a future state where God has eliminated all suffering and earthly afflictions. And maybe what Philip is describing is how it will actually happen. So if Philip is talking about this better version of Earth being superimposed on top of ours at some point, and that this Earth is in alignment with the divine feminine, then I guess you could say the divine feminine is coming back. And well, wouldn't you know it, that's what the lady told Chris Bledsoe. And also the book of Revelation talks about how the New Jerusalem is going to come down from heaven and land on earth. So the closer I look, the same story I keep finding over and over again. All right, now let's take the weird dial and let's turn it up to 11. Now, Philip is right, and there are multiple versions of Earth that we can shift to. Then the question would be, is there some type of technology where you can peer into these multiple realities and use it to your own advantage? Well, there's this idea that has floated around for years in UFO alternate reality circles, that there is something called looking glass technology. And this tech or device, it allows operators to see into the past, present, and alternative timelines. And the way they peer into these timelines is by hooking it up to an operator who navigates through these timelines using his own consciousness. And it's said that it is reverse engineered technology from ancient Sumeria. And of course, the military-industrial complex has control over this thing, and they use it to try and steer humanity in a way that suits them best. And the way I understand it is they supposedly use these think tank groups to come up with plans and ideas for governments and humanity, really. And they plug those things into this looking glass tech to see what the outcome will be. And when the outcome is favorable to their plans and purposes, they implement these things into society. And some suggest that the attacks on 9/11 were just that. That was carefully orchestrated to steer humanity in a direction that suited them. And when you start to look into this idea, they point to the wars in the Middle East over the past 20 plus years have actually been the military-industrial complex looking for this and more ancient technology. Now, I'm definitely going to do an entire episode on this at some point, because the deeper I look, I start to see the same patterns over and over again. And the pattern about this idea that stands out to me most is that this technology cannot view anything past 2012, because it's said that all possible outcomes collapse into one singular path. Some call it the end of history. And one of the whistleblowers, who is said to have worked directly with this technology, said that by late 2012, all versions of parallel Earths led to the same exit point. There was no divergence left to view, and it was so unnerving that they dismantled these devices. So, I think that's kind of funny. He describes a point of singularity happening in 2012, which is exactly what Terence McKenna was describing in his time wave zero theory. That time will hit a 0 point, a point of singularity, and that humanity will somehow take off to the stars. It also fits what he said about how there is a time island in between these two time streams, between the Earth that had Christianity on it and the Earth that didn't. And that after 2012, that time island will be passed and these two time streams will meet up again. And it also fits with the Mayan calendar, who had an end date of December 21st, 2012. It fits the pattern. And as Philip said, orthogonal time eventually leads to a breakthrough of the kingdom of God into linear time. And the illusion of the empire will begin to collapse as another order or reality presses through. Now, entertaining crazy ideas like this can be pretty unnerving, especially if you're used to our traditional religious type spiritual worldviews. And it makes me think, is there anybody out there who has our back? If the Gnostics were right, and this universe was kind of a mistake, and this Earth is a type of cosmic jail, are there any higher beings that care about us at all? Well, Philip spoke of what he called the programmer. He would describe the world as a simulation or a matrix, and that this programmer was the hidden architect of our simulation. Sometimes he equated this programmer with a benevolent God, but he also describes a flawed programmer in the mix too, whose bad programming can trap us in suffering. But he believed that we have an advocate who hacks the system from within to save us. For him, the Christ, or Logos, was a divine reprogrammer, reprogramming reality from the inside to save us from this false timeline. He also identifies this advocate as the Holy Spirit, and that it's God's active presence inside the system, intervening on behalf of human beings against injustice and liberating humanity from this black iron prison. But don't forget, Philip said that we have to be awake. And he referred to scriptures where Jesus said that the kingdom of God would come like a thief in the night, and that it would suddenly break into time, and that only those who are awake would recognize when this true reality comes through. And for him, being awake meant noticing déjà vu, strange time overlaps, synchronicities, and maybe even nowadays, the Mandela effect, and that these are all signs that the kingdom is near and pressing upon our linear time reality. So I think if you had to sum it all up, what does it mean to be awake? Well, I think that being awake means seeing through the illusion of this empire, this black iron thought prison, seeing through this fake timeline that lies to us about who we really are. And we have to realize, as Terence McKenna puts it, culture is not our friend, and that culture is actually a plot against the expansion of human consciousness. And by being awake to these ideas is what will allow us to see the kingdom when it comes. Or should I say, that's already here, running exactly parallel in orthogonal time. And maybe just accepting that as the actual truth is what determines who sees the kingdom and who doesn't. And when you look back through history, there's always been this idea that humanity needs to be liberated. The religions and the myths all had ideas of being liberated from death and even this reality. And maybe Philip K. Dick found out what we needed to be liberated from. Now, in closing, I think I'll get Philip to pray. Philip took that cry throughout human history for humanity to be liberated and set free, and he turned it into a modern-day prayer, one that takes into account orthogonal time and parallel Earths connected together through some type of lateral axis. Now, with every head bowed and every eye closed, listen to Philip's prayer.
Extricate me, programmer, as you achieve one victory after another. Include me in that triumph. Move me along the lateral axis so that I am